At this point in time, I'd like to call up our third sponsor of today's program, Thomson Reuters, and have Rick King give our special introduction for Governor Pawlenty. Rick, please come forward.
Thank you, Pat. Hello, everybody. Kind of dead out there. It's better. It's better. I'm the warm-up guy. The Eden Prairie Chamber of Commerce has three particular missions, elements of its mission that dovetail nicely with Governor Pawlenty's distinguished career. First, the opportunity for community leadership. Since his days on the Egan Planning Commission, City Council, the Governor has been a leader in the community. His public life, from state representative, House Majority Leader to two-term governor, and where else might that lead? We don't know. Whatever his title, he continues to collaborate with local leaders to develop a brighter future for Minnesota. The second element of the mission, act as an advocate for commerce. Minnesota's business climate has benefited from this governor and his understanding that commerce is the engine that drives the state and enhances the quality of life for all of its residents. His consistent no tax increase message is appreciated by more groups than just this one in the room today. The final element of the mission, promote community growth and development. The governor and his family live just a stone's throw from the Thomson Reuters campus in Egan, and I know he would agree that strong communities have a balanced tax base and amenities that attract families like strong schools and access to health care. This governor represents all of these three main missions in the Chamber of Commerce statement. So please join me in welcome Governor Tim Pawlenty.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. Sounds like the beginning of Star Wars. You're waiting for the ship to land and all the rest. I want to just share a story with you about my older daughter, Anna. She's now 15, but when she was much younger, kind of a toddler age, I had gone through this phase when I was a young parent of wanting to be as good of a parent as I could be. So I went out and got some books and tapes on parenting and was learning how to use these techniques about parenting. So I got home one night after a long night, I think at the legislature, Eric, and I said to my wife, honey, I'll put Anna to bed, don't worry about it. And so my wife went off and I got her cleaned up and got her jammies on and put her to bed. And I was seated at the edge of her bed looking down at her, and she was looking up at me, and I said, honey, if God let me line up all the little girls in the whole world and choose anyone as my daughter, I just wanted you to know that I would choose you. I'd heard this on the tape, but it sounded good, and I believed it. It was kind of a tender moment. I kind of was choking up a little bit and kind of sensing that this was going to be a great response. And she looks up at me and she says, Daddy, you got a big spit bubble hanging from the corner of your mouth? I share that with you because we've got a lot of challenge as a country and as a state and respective states across the country. And it's easy to focus on the spit bubbles, whether they are in the form of high gas prices or whether they're in the form of a continuing war or whether they're in the form of a very rapidly changing economy and many other challenges and worries that we all face. But I also think it's important to step back from that as leaders and as community members and just also count our blessings and be grateful for what we do have. The fact of the matter is that this is the freest and most prosperous nation in the history of the world. There is no country, there are no people, anywhere, anytime, any place, ever, that have experienced more freedom and more liberty and more prosperity than those of us fortunate enough to live in the United States of America in these modern times. So do we have our challenges? Yes. Do we have our headaches? You bet. Are there going to be more bumps in the road? Of course. But look what we have, and I think, as my mom used to say, gratitude opens the door to more blessing. And I'm grateful that we live in such a great state, and I'm grateful to be here with you in one of our leading communities in all of Minnesota, and that is the city of Eden Prairie. I was sharing with the mayor earlier about what a fantastic community this is, and what it means to our state in terms of the economy, in terms of the contribution that it makes to the state. It's well run, it's well led, and we're proud of Eden Prairie and grateful for all that it contributes to Minnesota. I wanted to just share a couple of thoughts with you today and then open the floor for questions, but I want to frame the two main topics I want to speak to you about in the context of two stories that I hope shine a light on the future and a couple of really key strategically important areas for our state and for our nation. And the first story is, imagine yourself as a future university student. And let's say you live in an area like Eden Prairie or say Stillwater or a place like that, and you have the opportunity in rush hour to drive on a January day under challenging temperatures, say an hour to get over to the University of Minnesota campus. And once you get to campus, you park at a remote parking lot, and then you carry your backpack like I did as a university student, say a 20-minute walk across the campus in challenging temperatures, to then find yourself in a lecture hall where you're seated and getting a lecture on, say, Economics 101 with maybe 1,000 other university students. And the professor there may be particularly talented or maybe not. The quality that that professor may exhibit may be world-class and maybe not. Or do you think the future relates more to, now keep in mind the generation that's behind most of us in this room, how they communicate, how they absorb information, how they obtain information, how they socialize, how they collaborate, how they connect, how they transmit and store data. Do you think that generation is going to do what I just described? Or do you think they might get up in the morning and stay in their pajamas, hopefully not, but it makes the story more interesting, and have a cup of coffee and sit down in their living room or den and dial up through a digitally stored or web-based format an Economics 101 lecture from wherever in the world they want to get it, when they want to get it, how they want to get it, and at a level of quality that they will demand. I'm talking, of course, about the iPod generation, and that is a metaphor or an icon for what's to come in so many areas. And I share that higher educational experience story with you because I believe that the disruptive effects of technology are about to be visited into education to a degree and in a manner that is going to mimic the way that technology has invaded and destroyed and recreated entire sectors of our economy already. And you see this happening even as we sit here today. I just was in North Carolina a couple weeks ago, and I had a chance to spend some time with the president of the University of North Carolina. Now, he's the former chief of staff to President Clinton, and so I wasn't expecting a lot out of the discussion. But I was incredibly impressed. This is Erskine Bowles, who had a hand in founding Capella University, by the way, which is based in Minnesota, and went off to serve President Clinton in our country, and then now he's the president of University of North Carolina, and he said they have 90 full degree programs available over the internet, 90. And he said within 5 years, and for sure within 10, they will have more students getting degrees granted from internet programs than they do in their traditional program. That is a reflection or a glimpse into the future. And that is going to revolutionize higher education, and we need to make sure we foresee these coming changes, that and more, and get ready for it, and begin to strategically reposition our institutions in Minnesota to be designed for the future, not to be designed for the past. And that is not a criticism. The institutions that we have here in the area of education, which is one of the topics I want to talk to you about a little bit today, and the other is energy. These institutions are wonderful institutions. They've served us very well. The results for Minnesota historically and comparatively are good. We're nation leading. But they defy a number of undeniable realities. One of the realities is we don't compete and compare ourselves anymore to the rest of the country. we compete against the rest of the world. And when you stack up our students, but not the top half, but the bottom half of our students compared to the rest of the world, the comparison isn't very good. Number two, the numbers mask the reality that these are average results. And what the average paper's over is we have a group of students, primarily from areas of concentrated socioeconomic disadvantage, who are doing very poorly and have done very poorly for 30 years, and it's become intergenerational, and it's a moral and economic crisis and imperative for our country to more boldly and effectively address it. And number three, these institutions were designed a long time ago, mostly in the 1950s or 40s, and they were designed for a bygone era, for a bygone economy, with bygone learning habits and behaviors that really do not reflect what's taking place now and will not reflect in the future. So we have a great opportunity to lead the change. We can either lead it or it will be visited upon us. Do you really think, there's this university in Arizona, I think it's the University of Phoenix, online university. Do you really think people would prefer to get a degree from the University of Phoenix or a degree from one of our state college and university institutions in Minnesota or the University of Minnesota? I mean, why would we cede market share to the University of Phoenix? Why would we have our public institutions be on the point, be on the lead on these matters? The University of Minnesota, I'm told, in total offers 10 degrees online, 10 out of the thousands that they have. We are very busy focused on how many more buildings can we build. And I would suggest to you the future may not have primarily to do about the number of buildings in many of these areas. It may have to do with the application and deployment of technology in this creative way. Now the challenge is, this is a big pivot for our systems. This is a very large pivot, and it applies not just to higher, about K-12 as well. But just very quickly, a second story. Think about 10 years from now that each of us are in our cars. And you will be in a car that will, in all likelihood, feature a plug-in electric capability. That car by then will have the ability you'll put it in your garage at night and you'll plug it into the wall in a retail outlet or a residential outlet. One night's charge will take your car by then probably 70 to 100 miles without any use of an engine at all, combustion engine at all. To the extent you need an engine, it will be backed up by an engine that will run on a variety of fuel sources, but certainly including the next generation biofuels, which will be dramatically more efficient, and they need to be, believe me, and use not food, but waste products to create biofuels. So we will be able to drive our cars 10 years from now on essentially no fossil fuels. But we need to get ready for that future, and we need to move, obviously, for obvious reasons, very boldly. So a couple of quick thoughts on each area, and then I'm just going to open it up for questions, just on education and energy. In education, one of the debates that we have in Minnesota and around the country is simply, how can we improve education? And the debate usually boils down to, how much more money are you willing to put into it? That's an important question, and it's one important measure. The costs for education systems go up. They're heavily organized and unionized, and there are fixed costs that go into salary settlements and step and lane adjustments and cost of living adjustments and pensions and health care packages, and the bulk of the money is in people, and so their costs go up. So we need to get them some additional money. I understand that. But we have to also ask these institutions, as we strive in a changing world of changing demographics. We used to have 1 million K through 12 students in Minnesota. We have 800,000 currently. We're going down to 700,000. That as that demographic continues to change, both in terms of number and location, that the institutions also be asked to reform and streamline and improve and modernize and be more accountable, not just for the inputs, but for the results. Eden Prairie, in relative terms, does extremely well. I mean, you have an extraordinary school system here, and I know there are challenges here as well. So some of what I'm talking about may not apply as to the same degree in Eden Prairie. But yes, we need to get more money to our schools, but let's also make sure that, and as we get into the fall and the next legislative session, you're going to hear me talking a lot about these issues. Let's make sure that we also push further the transition of how we pay people in education from a seniority-based system to a performance system. There is not many professions left. In fact, if you're not in government, raise your hand here if you get paid just for seniority? One guy does, okay. Do you work in the private sector? Yeah, I said if you're not in government. Okay. If you're not in government, raise your hands if you get paid just for seniority. Nobody does. The world has moved on. So we have to, if we're going to put most of the money into people, which is an okay thing, then let's make sure that the money is aligned to the results that we want, which is some of the money should be dedicated to whether the system is yielding a better result. And the result isn't how we feel about it. The result is whether students are learning. And we can measure that now, unlike 20 years ago, with extraordinary precision. By class, by teacher, by site, by district, however you want to slice and dice it, you can do it, and it's very accurate. One of the complaints is we have too much testing, but that doesn't go to the issue of whether it's accurate or not. It's accurate. And so we need to move to performance pay. That's number one. Number two, we have to embed technology more deeply and more broadly in the educational systems. That example I gave earlier is just the tip of the iceberg. But you have now children with different languages, different backgrounds, different learning speeds, different learning aptitudes, different interests. They learn in different ways at different speeds. The 1950s one-size-fits-all assembly line is not how these kids learn and absorb and communicate. They learn and absorb and communicate in a digital world. And so how we use that iPod metaphor and put that into a K-12 classroom becomes very important. To give you one example of that, in the high school system, Bill Gates stood at a gathering of governors 2 or 3 years ago. He said the American high school is obsolete. This is Bill Gates. That we have a high school system that has about a third of our kids who are the high flyers doing great, a third of our kids who are at risk of dropping out or dropping out, and the middle third just kind of coasting. But the high school needs to be reinvented along the lines to make it look like a polytechnic institute and or a college preparatory academy. We do not have that now to the level that we do. We have it to a degree, but we don't have it now. That means more advanced placement, more international baccalaureate, more college in the schools, more schools in the colleges, more post-secondary enrollment options, more online learning. We will keep and preserve the physical asset we have to because it's a point of sports and social contact and the like. But the gateway to the world is no longer a teacher and a blackboard. The gateway in the world has to be in substantial part the use and deployment of this technology. We wonder, how are we going to teach Chinese or Mandarin in parts of greater Minnesota, or how are we going to get more Spanish teachers into a particular site? Candidly, for many kids, they can learn that on the internet. Not exclusively, it's a supplement to the classroom. But you can learn a lot of Spanish in a big hurry at your own speed at a level of quality and robustness and digitized very rapidly. And you get economies of scale, you can drive quality, you can manage it, you can go at your own speed. People who need extra help can get it through tutorials. People who can move ahead. So there's a lot that's behind all of this. I will also tell you, just lastly on education, the number one determining factor of how a child's going to do in school is their parents. In other words, it's a proxy for how the environment in which they are raised. There's no question about that. It is undeniable, and the statistics are compelling. If you live in a neighborhood and a family and a community that functions reasonably well, your local school will in all likelihood do reasonably well. If you live in a neighborhood that is unraveled, it is likely that the school in that area has unraveled or at least is challenged. And so we have a real problem, and as I mentioned earlier, it's become intergenerational. President Reagan, President Bush the first, President Clinton, President Bush II, all declared a national crisis in education, and the numbers haven't moved very substantially. So we have the kids who are most at risk are kids who have broken families and concentrated disadvantage. We can't legislate a change to that. I wish we could, but it's incumbent upon all of us, whether you are a community leader, business leader, a concerned citizen, a neighbor, a friend, to at least speak to and support the idea that children need to be in stable environments and have a stable parent, hopefully two parents, to be raised with the maximum probability that they're going to succeed and be given the maximum chance. Now, that doesn't happen in every instance, but this idea that we don't comment on such things because it's incorrect is incorrect. It's important to say that people need to graduate from high school, be in a stable relationship before they have kids, ideally, make sure their life is stabilized before they take on the responsibility of raising children. And that is not happening as much as it should. And it's having a devastating effect on kids. And we need to be more responsible and more direct about communicating that and upholding that as an expectation in our communities. But beyond that, the second most important factor of how kids are going to do in school is their teachers. And teachers are wonderful people. And in this room there, I'm sure teachers or relatives of teachers. But we have a teaching system that is not where it needs to be in terms of how we recruit teachers, how we pay them, how we train them, and the accountability and rigor that we put around them in terms of their performance. Teachers do not get paid too much. They get paid too little, but they don't get paid the right way. The money isn't aligned to the results. A couple of quick examples. We have an undeniable shortage coming of math and science teachers. We need really smart people who have mathematics or scientific backgrounds to go into and stay in teaching. It's not happening at nearly the rate it needs to. And guess what? We pay them the same as all the other teachers. Now, in the real world, if you have a shortage of something and need more of it, what's one of the things that you might think of doing? You would pay them more. So if we're really serious about saying math and science and a few other disciplines are comparatively more important, then we have to be able to willing to say we are willing to pay more for those professions. Number two, we have to be open to the idea of people at different life stages becoming teachers, at least for a while. The old model was really great, committed, dedicated people would come in as young professionals, enter the profession, and leave 30 years later. 47% of the teachers in America now leave the profession within the first 5 years of teaching. There are some great programs. That first thing I talked about, by the way, is differential pay. Performance pay, paying for results. The second thing I talked about is paying certain teachers more, particularly with in-need backgrounds. It's called differential pay. The third thing that we need to focus on is this idea of alternative pathways into teaching. It's unlikely that most teachers are going to hang around for 20 or 30 years like they did previously. Department of Labor now says people have 14 jobs by the age of 38, average. Think about that. So we need to find programs like Teach for America, programs like KIPP schools, where it's okay for people who have engineering degrees, mathematics degrees, chemistry degrees, to come in on get the training, but can be accelerated. It's not 4 more years at the School of Education, and at least for a while commit themselves in public service and dedication to teaching. It might be 3 years, it might be 5 years. If we can get a few good years out of them, great. But they are, in most cases, in these Teach for America style programs, the best and brightest of the country has to offer, who are willing, at least for a while, to try teaching. Many of them stay, not all of them do, but if we can get them for a period of time, that's great. And on the other end of the continuum, there are people in the private sector or other walks of life who have enormous skills. It might be a 50-year-old chemist from 3M, or it might be a person who's an engineer from another company who've made their money or view that they're willing to spend the last 5 or 10 years of their career in public service teaching. So for that individual, we should have an accelerated pathway, alternative pathway back into teaching for a period of time. The reason we need to do all of this is because we are not attracting the kinds of people that we need into teaching in terms of either subject matter or candidly skill set. The generation of teachers that was, quality-wise, is very substantially better than what we're seeing in terms of people entering the teaching profession now. And that's not a good sign. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So there's much more to be done, but a few thoughts on education. Just quickly on energy. We cannot confront the challenges of our time with the energy platform and portfolio that we have right now. And that should be painfully obvious to all of us. And we have to diversify our energy sources and grow them and Americanize them. We have an energy platform right now that has got the country in crisis, and I think it's going to get worse. And so there's no one silver bullet, particularly in this transition phase between what was and the kind of future I described a few minutes ago. But we're going to need to make sure that in terms of the supply and demand equation, that we have significant more supply of energy. And it's not going to be done with one thing. We are going to need to have clean coal, not the old style coal, clean coal. We're going to have to reopen the door on nuclear energy. It is zero emissions. The French and the Europeans are reprocessing the nuclear fuel rods so we can extend the life of the plants without creating additional nuclear waste. We should be able to do that here. We're going to need to make sure that we move as aggressively as possible into biomass and biogas and geothermal and next generation biofuels and solar and everything we can reasonably get our hands on. And the goal is to make sure, number one, we unhook ourselves from the parts of the world that either from a national security standpoint or economic standpoint want to do us great harm. We are addicted to them, and they are not on our side. And we need to unhook from that. And number two, we need to have a more diverse and cleaner energy portfolio. But that's not ready yet, the cleaner part. It's coming. But in the meantime, we got to do all these things I just described and not do it in a way that's going to wreck our economy. But we can do all of this. I'll just close with that comment from Tom Friedman. He wrote the book, Of Course, the World is Flat. And I had him on my radio show last Friday, and I asked him about what Peter Drucker said about his book. Peter Drucker died, but right before he died, he had a comment about the world is flat. And I said to Drucker, what do you think about Friedman's work, The World is Flat? And Drucker said, not for very long. Not for very long. The idea that everything's going to be the same everywhere is naive, that there will always be material or comparative advantage that will materialize and dissipate over time. And whoever sees these future trends and can seize them and anticipate, is going to gain advantage. Minnesota is a fantastic state, and America is a fantastic country. And Friedman's first book was concluded cynically and skeptically, but he came back and wrote a prologue to his second edition, which was much more optimistic and positive. And he said that the reason he's optimistic and positive is because America is the great dream machine. We're sometimes a little slow to respond, but once we do, we've got enormous and unlimited and world-leading creative capacity. And I think the country's at the point now where we're going to respond, hopefully very aggressively, on energy. But I would suggest to you that equally important, and perhaps more important in terms of the citizens that we serve, is how we deal with this education issue. It's hardly being addressed at all at the presidential race so far. I hope that changes. But at least in Minnesota, we cannot be so smug about our past success that we think all we have to do is add inflation and move on down the road. We got a great state, but this is not the 1970s or 1960s where people start a business here because their family's been here and they kind of like the upper Midwest and their market is the upper Midwest. This has all changed. And we have got to be competitive in all that implies. And one measure of competitiveness is, do we have the right talent here to create, to invent, to research, to teach, to innovate, to take risks, to deploy capital, to create art and all the things that we need to be a successful community. And that goes right to the heart of whether our education system is going to be successful, not on average, but for everybody in Minnesota and in the country. We've got a lot of work to do. So with those two things as points of emphasis, I'll be happy to take your questions. Thanks for listening. If you're in South Korea, for example, which now has some of the world's best math results, do you know what most rural South Korean children do to learn math? They digitally dial in and learn it over the internet because they have a aggressive nationwide broadband policy which allows access to that. You cannot get to the future I just described unless we have high-speed enhanced broadband. So that's an issue that hopefully this task force will create or update the roadmap, and the public policies and funding will come behind that. It's going to have to be a pretty significant investment. It's happened in Minnesota, but it's happened not in a consistent fashion geographically, and we'll look to, if it doesn't work, we'll blame Rick. Yes? We have a very different culture here in the United States than they do in other parts of the world, and I think it's good. In other parts of the world, they're pretty brutal in terms of the assessment of children earlier in their educational career, and they put them on tracks. You're on the college track, you're on the vocational track. That's, particularly at young ages, that's pretty inconsistent with how we do things in the United States. We don't tell people you're in a slot, so I wouldn't embrace or advocate that. However, we have jobs that are good-paying jobs that are not being filled and could be filled by people with some reasonable amounts of post-high school training. I don't think people philosophically object to vocational training and encouragement, at the post-high school level. I'll give you one example. In Lakeville, an owner of a company said, look, I can hire 10 welders, and I will pay them $50,000 or $60,000 a year. And if they're willing to work overtime, I can get their pay up to $70,000 or $80,000 a year with benefits, and I can't fill the jobs. And I said, how long would it take you to train a welder to, at least journey person's level? He said, less than 90 days. Less than 90 days. And he would pay for the training. And so here we have a third of our people nationally dropping out of high school. If you drop out of high school now, it's not like my parents' generation or grandparents' generation. I mean, the manual labor jobs with good benefits that would support a family are gone. So you either have a skill or an education, or you are in deep trouble in this economy currently. So we got a third of our kids nationally dropping out of high school. If you drop out of high school, there's a 60% chance that you end up in the criminal justice system. There's a higher chance that you'll end up on one or more of all the government programs, government housing, government transportation, government health care, government fill in the blank. They become a ward of the state in whole or in part. It's not good for them, not good for us. And yet we have jobs like that are going unfilled, that could be filled with a reasonable amount of training. And the primary answer we get from, particularly in the manufacturing sector, is people think that job is beneath them, that it's quote unquote dirty, that it's boring, that it's monotonous. And so we have, there's a place in Rochester I was at 2 weeks ago where it's a high-tech manufacturing facility. They said we could add 200 people easily. This is a clean environment, white ceilings, white floors, windows, people work there with white coats on, but it's a form of manufacturing. And they said they can't find people to work the jobs because it's the feedback they got from the job applicants was the standing there doing repetitive things all day was too boring for them. And these are $40,000, $50,000 a year jobs. So we have a problem with our culture has decided, or in part, that they don't want to do certain jobs. That's unfortunate. And I think we need to do a better job in reintroducing people into modern polytechnic experiences. University of Wisconsin Stout, for example, has the best product packaging program, or one of the best in the country. And so people go there as a polytechnic experience to learn how you design and affix packaging onto products. You come out of that program, you get a job, you make $70,000 a year. Pretty good deal. But to answer your question, we have de-emphasized vocational training because I think for reasons that everybody who's going to emphasize traditional college, and at least post-high school, we should be reintroducing and remarketing our technical and vocational programs in more effective ways. Yes. Minnesota is the third largest wind energy producer in the country, behind only California and Texas. We have a wind energy credit that we give in Minnesota, and nationally they do as well. The price per kilowatt hour of wind has dropped from 15 cents to 5 cents. It's competitive. It's probably the most affordable renewable energy now, and it's going to drop even further as the economies of scale get even better. It's a great supplement to our energy needs. It can't be the whole answer because it's episodic. Hard to run a manufacturing facility if you're reliant completely on wind and the wind isn't blowing. So it's got to be backed up by another facility. So the future looks a lot like wind energy production, particularly in windy areas in southwestern Minnesota, co-located or backed up, at least linked up, with a traditional facility that will be a baseload energy. But it's going great, and we can't. The biggest problem we have on wind is we don't have enough transmission lines. There's endless appetite for people to build wind turbines, but you can't just put a wind turbine anywhere. You got to put it somewhere where you can run some lines and get the energy or the electricity back to the user. There was a question over here. Question was, why does Minnesota continue to be a high-tax state? Wow, that's a good question. If you look at the country very bluntly, and you look where the growth is demographically and economically, it's south and west. There are a few exceptions, but in general, the demographic and economic pattern of the country is moving south and west. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but disproportionately, investment and economic growth is appearing in places that have more favorable business and tax climates. It's not the only reason people are doing that, but it is one of the reasons. Our proposition in Minnesota can't be that we're going to be the cheapest place, because our tradition, our heritage, and our history wouldn't allow that, nor do we want to go there. I mean, who would want to be the lowest bidder in terms of labor rates, wage rates, quality of life issues relative to one of the other states that might come to mind as a low-cost place? But even if you could do that, then what happens if the next competitor is Malaysia or Cambodia? I was talking to a CEO not long ago, and he said, the East Coast is killing me. He said the environmental regulations are burdensome, the costs are too high, the real estate market and taxes are out of control. He said, I got to move inland, I got to move west. I was thinking, this is my opportunity. I said, well, Minnesota, we're in the middle of the country, it'll work out great. He said, I'm talking about China. He said, we're on the east coast of China, it's too expensive, we're going to move inland. So you can't chase, if you're Minnesota, we're the cheapest place model. But if you're not going to be the biggest place, and you're not going to be the cheapest place, then you got to be the smartest place, and that's why this education is so important. But we also can't be so smug. And I would say one of Minnesota's dangers is people are a little bit complacent about how good it's been and not worried about how we're going to keep it that way in a changing world. And Minnesota cannot be so smug to think that you can afford to have your price be so high above everybody else's in terms of taxes, regulation, insurance, energy, mandates, unemployment, workers' comp, healthcare, that won't have an effect in a competitive marketplace. We don't have to be the cheapest place, but we also can't price ourselves so far out of range on the competitive spectrum that it becomes a further disincentive to capital formation, entrepreneurial activity, business formation, building of buildings, research and development, purchase of capital equipment, adding of jobs. And I don't like to say this, particularly in chambers of commerce, but our business climate here is not good. We've made some modest progress from about being the worst in the country when I became governor to being ninth worst, depending on what survey you look at. We're top 10 worst in the country on almost every business climate survey. Again, we don't have to be the best, but you also can't be out of range on the high end. So my proposition is we're pretty much taxed enough in Minnesota, and I'd like to say we don't need to go higher, and over time we need to make it better. Every governor since Rudy Perpich, Arnie Carlson, Jesse Ventura, and me said it's critically important that we at least get Minnesota out of the top 10 in taxes. Last year we finally did that after 30 years of governors trying, and we went from 4th to 11th or something. So it's progress. I will tell you this year on property taxes coming out of the legislature, we capped them at 3.9% with exceptions for natural disasters, police and fire and those kinds of things. I think that's a reasonable limit to set. Minnesota's got a big appetite. I mean, the heritage and culture here is we got a robust government involvement, and in many ways you can make your judgments about how that's worked. But what can't work is you can't price yourself out of the market. And so you can't have one of the highest personal income tax in the country, one of the highest corporate tax rates in the country, no preferential rate for capital gains, and extraordinarily high other business-related impacts, and not expect business people to say, I got other options. If you're a Minnesota business person, you're going to sell your business, and you get no preferential rate for capital gains. Guess what a lot of them do? Year before they sell, they're out of here. They're not going to cough up 8% to the state of Minnesota for the privilege of selling their business here. So they go set up residency somewhere else, sell the business, take the capital gains, in a place where they have a preferential rate or no capital gains, and then we lose them. We lose them as business leaders, business investors, risk takers, entrepreneurs, angel investors, board members, philanthropists, and we lose a lot of them. And people are wondering, well, why these people not stay? Well, they stay because the level of financial kind of consequence for being in business is in some ways anti-competitive. Yes, and just so we're clear now, E85 is the fuel that is 85% ethanol. There's a little dust up about that in the governor's race in 2006. But biofuels, whether it's ethanol or biodiesel, can play a really important role, but they have to change. What happened, in short, is In the 1990s and late 80s, there was huge commodity surpluses. Prices were low. We had excess corn and excess grains. And so that's the context in which the industry, the biofuels industry, started, and I'm glad it did. It's a pioneering effort. It will help a lot. But what people predicted was over 15 or 20 years, as world demand for these grains and foods increased, that the ethanol and biofuels industry would have to transition to some other source to make the fuel. That future came not 20 years out from the late 1990s, but it came 10 years out. So a much quicker collapse of what people predicted. The future is going to be what's called cellulosic ethanol for the biofuels or biodiesel. It's going to be 8 or 9 times more efficient. It's not going to use food to make fuel. It will use switchgrass, fast-growing trees, the byproducts of the paper or timber industry, municipal garbage, weeds, grass clippings, mulch. I mean, you'll if this technology is borne out, and we'll know in the next 24 months whether it is or isn't, because there's pilot projects being built all over the country, it will supplement and change the entire biofuels industry in the country. And obviously, in the future, the issue can't be we're going to take food and make it into fuel. It was a good start. We had to start somewhere, at least got the discussion going, it got the momentum going behind it, but now they need to transition to the next generation biofuels, and I think they can do it, but we'll know shortly. In the meantime, the ethanol industry has got a hold on new plants and stuff. They're just kind of waiting to see what the next breakthrough is. Yes?
I'm a physics teacher in Mankato. Good thoughts on education.
All right, physics teacher. We should pay you more. I think we're going to have to think about a grand bargain where we figure out a way to get more money into this educational system for the kinds of things that I think most people could agree on. But the exchange or the return is going to have to be, what are you willing to do to reform and change? And one piece of that, could be a substantial infusion of new technology. And I would also go so far as to say the idea of people going to a classroom and listening to a lecture, at least as you get into high school age and college, may not even really be the model. I mean, everybody's brain is around, how can we get 30 computers in a room and have an adult in there floating around? For many things, not all things, it may well be that you come to class in college, once a week, every 2 weeks, and there's a lot of classes that you may never need to come. I mean, if I can sit home in my living room and have a digital presentation about Spanish and learn it in 3 months rather than 9 months and test out, why do I need to drive over to the U and walk across campus and get run over by the, no, I won't say that. No, it's going to be great. It's going to be great. The institutions themselves should be taking the lead on these kinds of changes. The university and the Minsky system is doing a great job. I mean, they are holding down tuition. They got accountability measures in place. They're moving to online classes, but they should have been doing this 5 years ago, and they should be out in front on it. But as to technology, it's going to require, for people who can't afford it, for people who are of means, they all got computers and they all got broadband sitting in their living room. I mean, the question is, well, how can we get them broadband? They got it. The question is, what do we do for those who can't afford it? Or, do you really need to aggregate it in a classroom somewhere? Is that really the model of the future, or is it a distributed model? Go ahead. The other thing on science and math is we got a cultural problem in the sense that too many students think it's too hard. Now, you're talking to the governor who just required everybody's got to have Algebra 1 by 8th grade to get out of 8th grade, and Algebra 2 to graduate from high school now. By the way, all of our school standards have been beefed up, which is good, and instead of just biology, you got to have chemistry or physics also now to graduate from high school, so we added those requirements. But we have a major challenge trying to get more kids more interested and excited about science and math, engineering and technology, and it's cultural in part. And what I mean by that is we celebrate as a culture what? Sports, entertainment, everybody's focused on, the Timberwolves, the Wild, it's all fun and interesting, but think about the amount of time, and be honest with yourselves, and I'll be honest with you. I mean, the amount of time I spent on volleyball courts, soccer fields, sporting activities compared to, math camp, tutoring chemistry, figuring out some interesting way to get my kids exposed to science or math is embarrassingly bad. And, about junior high, we start to lose them. They're kind of interested until about 8th grade, and then they kind of fritz out on us. There's a select group that stays. But give you one statistic to think about. India by itself is going to graduate this year 500,000 technologists and engineers. We're going to graduate 50,000. They were mocking me when we were in India, saying the United States will graduate more psychology degrees and sociology degrees than we will engineers. And you can make your own value judgment about that, but in a hyper-competitive world where the ultra premium is on innovation, science, and technology, that's not a good statistic, in my view. And so we have to culturally start celebrating and encouraging science and math, technology, engineering much more robustly than we do. And the teachers are trying, but it's not working nearly at the rate and pace and scope that it needs to. And I wish we could get the same amount of energy and excitement and enthusiasm around a physics event than we could around a football or a hockey game or a soccer field tournament. All right, last one, then we got to get you back to work. Go ahead. Question for those who couldn't hear was, this energy crisis we're in now, from our questioner, looks a lot like the energy crisis of the 70s, and we didn't do much since then. And what happened in part was the crisis subsided and the price dropped back down partly, and we all went back to sleep mode. This time, I would suggest to you the price spike is severe, and it's going to be with us. I mean, if you see one disruption, whether it be a hurricane, whether it be a terrorist incident in Saudi Arabia, one significant disruption in the international oil markets will bring us not $4 a gallon gas, but $6 or $7 a gallon gas in a big hurry. And so this is a very significant issue. I think the price will stay high, unfortunately. And number two, people are mad, and understandably mad, and they want action. And so I think that will translate into both public policy and economic activity around changing the platform. And the good news is it sort of started. I talked to some people yesterday that are build these furnaces that burn pellets instead of natural gas or electricity. They can't even make them fast enough. I mean, they're making them and selling them as fast as they can. People are hungry for trying to change their lifestyles or change their energy habits to save some money or be more efficient. You can't get a Prius now, it's on a waiting list. People want fuel-efficient vehicles. They're interested in conservation in their homes and energy. They're interested in new energy technology. So I really sense there's been a tipping point in the public's appetite and attention and interest in this. And I think that's going to translate into good things. Yeah, go ahead. None. I don't want to give a political speech because that's not why I came, but I'm honored to have my name mentioned, but the fact of the matter is I haven't been asked. I don't expect to be asked, and I'm very happy with my current position. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.